They found me unworthy of their loyalty, and in that moment of abandonment, I discovered I had never truly known myself at all. The morning they left me behind, the frost clung to every branch like a funeral shroud woven by the cold fingers of winter itself. I woke to silence where there should have been voices, warmth, the familiar rhythm of a life shared with those I called family for so many years of my existence. My pack had vanished into the white wilderness sometime before the first gray light of dawn, leaving only footprints that the falling snow was already erasing with patient, indifferent grace. I called out until my throat burned raw, and my voice became nothing more than a ragged whisper carried away by the bitter wind. But the ancient forest swallowed my cries the way it swallows all things eventually, without mercy or memory. They believed I carried a curse within my blood, that my presence had somehow caused the death of my beloved Torvin during the last hunt, when the ice broke beneath his feet, and the hungry river claimed his life forever beneath its frozen surface. Grief became guilt in their fearful eyes, and guilt became something unforgivable that demanded exile as its bitter and final price. For 3 days, I wandered without direction or purpose through the endless white expanse, surviving on frozen berries that stained my fingers purple and melted snow, cupped in my trembling frost-bitten hands. My cloak, once the rich color of autumn leaves that Torvin had always admired, grew heavy with ice and dragged behind me like a morning gown. I thought I might never find shelter, that the winter would claim me before I found my way. But something kept my legs moving forward, some stubborn flame burning in the deepest part of my chest that refused to be extinguished, pushing me onward through the unbearable cold. On the 4th day, when I had given up all hope, I found her. The Great Mother Tree. The villagers called her in their hushed legends passed down through generations. She rose from the forest floor like a cathedral built by the hands of ancient gods who had long since departed this world for realms beyond mortal understanding. Her trunk so massive and magnificent that 20 people holding hands could not encircle her tremendous girth. Centuries upon centuries of patient growth had hollowed her heart through some mysterious process of decay and renewal that spoke of magic older than memory, creating a space within that felt like a womb waiting to birth something new. I crawled through an opening between her gnarled roots that seemed almost to part for me in welcome, my body exhausted beyond measure, and found myself in a darkness that smelled of rich earth and pine resin and forgotten prayers, whispered by those who had come before me, seeking shelter and salvation from their own sorrows. I wept there for hours uncounted, curled against the inner walls of living wood like a child seeking comfort from a mother's eternal embrace. My tears fell upon the soft ground and were absorbed into the soil as if the tree herself was drinking my sorrow and transforming it into something else entirely, something that might one day bloom into hope. But when I finally lifted my head, I saw how the filtered light fell through tiny cracks in the bark, like threads of spun gold weaving intricate patterns on the earthen floor. I saw how the ground was soft with decades of fallen leaves that had decomposed into something resembling a mattress prepared just for me, how the curved walls offered shelter from wind and snow and cruelty. Something shifted in my chest then, a sensation I did not recognize at first, because it had been so desperately long since I had allowed myself to feel it. Hope. Fragile and foolish, perhaps, but hope nonetheless, flickering like a single candle flame in a drafty room that stubbornly refused to be blown out, no matter how the winds might howl. I began to build my sanctuary with whatever strength remained. Each day I ventured out into the surrounding forest to gather what nature offered freely to those patient enough to look and humble enough to receive with gratitude, returning before darkness fell to weave my findings into something resembling a true home. I fashioned a bed from pine boughs and dried moss collected from the northern faces of ancient stones, soft enough to ease my aching bones, and fragrant enough to fill my dreams with memories of summer meadows I had known in happier times long past. I created shelves from fallen bark and arranged them carefully along the curved walls, storing the herbs I collected and the mushrooms I learned to identify through careful trial, and the faded memory of my grandmother's patient teachings that came back to me like gifts from beyond the grave. She had been a healer in our village before the fever took her when I was barely a woman grown, and her knowledge lived in my hands like an inheritance more precious than any gold could ever be, even when my grieving mind felt empty of everything else that had once brought me joy. The villagers from the settlement beyond the eastern ridge knew of the Great Mother Tree through generations of whispered stories passed from parent to child around winter fires, but they feared her with a superstitious dread that kept them far away from her sacred presence. They said spirits dwelled within her countless rings, ancient beings who remembered every secret ever whispered in her shade, and every promise ever broken beneath her spreading branches that reached toward heaven like arms raised in endless prayer. I found unexpected comfort in this fear, for it meant no one would come looking for me in this hallowed place where the old magic still lingered in the very air itself. I became a ghost in my own story, invisible to the world that had rejected me so cruelly. And in that invisibility, I discovered a strange kind of freedom I had never known before in all my years of living among others, who now seemed like strangers I had never truly understood. It was during my second week within the tree that I first saw him, the magnificent creature who would change everything I believed about my place in this wounded world and the purpose for which I had been born. The moon hung full and luminous above the forest canopy, casting silver light through my small doorway and painting everything in shades of pewter and pearl and ghostly blue. I had stepped outside to fill my water vessel from the nearby stream, whose gentle voice had become a constant companion in my solitude when movement caught my eye at the edge of the clearing, subtle as a shadow separating itself from the darkness. There, standing motionless between two ancient oaks whose branches intertwined like the fingers of old lovers who refused to let go even in death, was a wolf unlike any I had ever seen in all my years of living close to the wild places at the edges of the human world. His fur gleamed white as fresh fallen snow in the moonlight, pure and unblemished except for the darkness of his nose and the unfathomable depths of his eyes that seemed to hold entire universes within them. But it was those very eyes that stole the breath from my lungs and made my heart forget its rhythm entirely. They burned amber in the silver light of the moon, twin flames that held an intelligence which seemed almost human in its depth and startling complexity, yet somehow far older and wiser than any human I had ever known. A jagged scar ran across his muzzle from some long-ago battle, evidence of enemies faced and defeated, of a life lived always on the edge of survival and triumph against impossible odds. I froze where I stood, my heart pounding against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. We stared at each other across the moonlit clearing for what felt like hours, compressed into mere heartbeats, neither moving, neither breathing, connected by something invisible that hummed in the cold air between us like a song remembered from forgotten dreams that lingered at the edge of waking. Then, as silently as he had appeared from the shadows, he turned his great head and dissolved back into the darkness from whence he came, leaving me alone with the pounding of my heart and a feeling I could not name no matter how I searched for words to describe it. He returned the following night, and the night after that, establishing a pattern that became the very rhythm of my new existence. Always watching from the tree line with those knowing amber eyes, never approaching close enough to threaten, never retreating entirely from my awareness. I began to leave offerings near the edge of the clearing as the days passed, scraps of dried meat from my meager winter stores, tokens of respect and tentative friendship for whatever magnificent being he truly was. In the morning, the offerings were always gone without trace, and in their place I would sometimes find gifts that could only have come from him. A rabbit, freshly caught, and still warm with the echo of life, laid carefully upon a flat stone. A bundle of healing herbs I had been searching for without success, tied together with a strand of silver fur. Once, a perfect white feather that seemed to glow with its own inner light, which I kept beside my bed like a talisman against the loneliness that still sometimes threatened to overwhelm my healing heart. The forest spoke to me in those quiet weeks of healing and discovery, teaching me its complex language through patience and careful observation of all its subtle signs and signals. I learned which plants could heal infected wounds, and which could bring fever and delirium, which mushrooms nourished the body, and which brought visions that lasted for days and showed truths that ordinary sight could never perceive. I learned to read the coming weather in the behavior of birds and the direction of the wind, to sense approaching storms in the ache of my own bones, before the first clouds appeared on the distant horizon. The great mother tree became my sanctuary, my temple, my mother in wood and bark, and ancient wisdom that whispered to me in the rustling of leaves and the creaking of her ancient limbs. I spoke to her sometimes in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, pressing my palms against her inner walls and feeling the slow pulse of sap that moved through her like blood through veins, almost like a heartbeat that echoed my own. But I was not entirely alone in those vast woods, and not all who dwelled within them wished me well. The hunters from the distant village had grown bolder in recent seasons, pushing deeper into the forest in their endless search for valuable pelts and meat to sell at market. I heard their dogs sometimes, baying in the distance like the voices of lost souls, and I would retreat into the protective darkness of my tree home until silence returned to the world outside. They were searching for the white wolf, I came to realize with growing alarm and anger. Stories of him had spread through the village like wildfire through dry summer grass. Tales of a beast with supernatural cunning who had evaded every trap and outwitted every hunter who dared pursue him. They called him the king of the frozen woods in their tavern boasts and fearful whispers, and they wanted his magnificent pelt to hang above some rich man's fireplace as a trophy of conquest over nature itself. The thought filled me with a rage I had not known I possessed, a protective fury that surprised me with its fierce intensity. I began to sabotage their efforts in small but meaningful ways, dismantling the cruel steel traps I found during my wanderings, scattering misleading trails to lead them away from the areas where I had seen wolf tracks, warning the forest creatures with calls I had learned from watching birds signal danger to their flocks. I became a protector without consciously choosing the role, a guardian of wild things I did not yet fully understand, but felt compelled to defend with everything I had within me. One evening, as the golden colors of autumn bled into the first true bitter cold of winter, I found a smaller wolf lying wounded near my stream. She was silver gray, like morning mist, with eyes like liquid amber that reminded me immediately of the White King himself, and she bore a hunter's arrow embedded deep in her flank. I approached slowly with my hands raised and my voice soft and soothing, speaking words of comfort as I would to a frightened child. She watched me with fear and pain, and something else beneath it all, something that looked almost like recognition or desperate hope.
We can do this.
I knelt beside her in the cold mud and examined the wound with careful fingers, my grandmother's knowledge guiding my hands as I assessed the damage and calculated what must be done to save her precious life. I could not carry her to my tree in her weakened state, so I built a shelter around her instead, a lean-to of woven branches, and my own warm cloak stretched overhead, beneath which I worked through the long and anxious night to save her. The arrow had gone deep into the muscle, but had mercifully missed the vital organs that would have meant certain death. I removed it with steady hands despite my racing heart, packed the wound with healing herbs I had gathered for exactly such emergencies, and stitched the torn flesh with thread I had made from the strong fibers of certain plants. Through it all, she never snapped at me with her powerful jaws, never struggled against my ministrations. She simply watched me with those knowing amber eyes, as if she understood exactly what I was doing and why I was doing it, and was grateful beyond what her wolf's voice could express. The white wolf appeared at the edge of the firelight while I worked on through the darkest hours of that anxious night. I looked up from my patient and found him standing there at the boundary of shadow and flame, his massive form outlined against the deeper darkness of the forest, his amber gaze fixed upon us both with an intensity that seemed to pierce my very soul. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, our eyes met across the flickering flames, I saw no threat in his gaze despite his terrifying size and power, only something vast and ancient and sorrowful that resonated with my own long loneliness. Then he lowered his great scarred head in what I can only describe as acknowledgement, or perhaps gratitude, and once again vanished into the night without sound. I stayed with the silver wolf for 3 days and 3 nights, never leaving her side except to gather more supplies for her care. I fed her broth made from healing herbs and fresh stream water, changed her bandages when they grew soiled with the fluids of healing, kept her warm against the encroaching cold with my own body heat when the fire burned low. I named her Luna, for the crescent-shaped marking on her chest that seemed to glow silver in certain lights. She grew stronger with each passing hour under my devoted care, and as she healed, something wounded within my own spirit began to heal as well. I had not realized how deeply the wound of abandonment had cut into my soul until I felt it beginning to close, stitched together by purpose and connection, and the simple act of caring for another living being. On the 4th morning, I woke to pale winter sunlight filtering through the branches and found them both standing at the edge of my clearing.
We're safe now.
The white wolf, magnificent and terrible in the early light, his breath steaming in the cold air, and Luna beside him, her tail wagging weakly but unmistakably as she saw me emerge from beneath my shelter. She limped toward me on legs still unsteady from her ordeal and pressed her muzzle against my palm, a gesture so tender and trusting that tears sprang unbidden to my eyes. The white wolf watched this exchange between us with what I would swear was approval in his ancient gaze, and when Luna returned to his side, he dipped his great head to me once more before leading her away into the forest depths where I could not follow. But they did not leave me entirely or forget what I had done. They began to visit my clearing regularly as the winter deepened around us, sometimes bringing others of their kind with them. I came to understand through careful observation that the white wolf was indeed a king of sorts, the undisputed alpha of a pack that roamed the wildest and most remote parts of the great forest. They were the last true wolves of these ancient mountains, descendants of bloodlines that stretched back unbroken to the time when the world was young and magic still walked openly upon the earth. And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, they had chosen to include me in their number. I learned their ways through patient observation. I ran with them on moonlit nights when the snow glowed blue beneath the stars, my human feet struggling to match their effortless grace, but my heart soaring with a joy I had never known existed. I shared their kills and their warmth, curling beside Luna in the hollow of my tree, while the white wolf stood guard outside, his silhouette against the moonlight like a statue carved from living snow. Frost Scar, the hunters called him in their fearful whispers, but to his pack, he was simply father, protector, king. The hunters had not abandoned their quest for his pelt. As winter deepened and snow piled higher than a man's waist, their incursions grew more dangerous. A wealthy lord from the southern cities had offered a fortune for the white wolf's head, and the hunters had grown mad with greed. It was Luna who came to warn me on the night everything changed, appearing at my doorway with panic blazing in her amber eyes, whimpering until I followed her into the frozen darkness. The forest was alive with terrible sounds, dogs baying for blood, and men shouting commands, torches flickering between the trees. They had tracked the pack to their winter den, a sacred cave system hidden deep in the northern reaches. The wolves were trapped. I ran as I had never run before, Luna guiding me through secret paths between the oldest trees. What I found still haunts my dreams. The hunters had cornered the pack at the cave's mouth, their dogs snapping with bloodlust, their spears raised against the moonlight. Frost Scar stood at the front of his family with his white fur stained red with blood, his amber eyes blazing with defiance that refused to surrender even facing certain death. Something broke free inside me then, something wild and ancient and powerful that had been sleeping in my blood since before I was born. I stepped into the clearing between hunters and wolves and raised my voice in a sound that was neither word nor song, but something older than language itself, old as the mountains and the stars. It was the voice of the forest, speaking through me, commanding through me. The dogs fell silent. The men lowered their weapons, their faces pale with a fear they could not name. I told them these woods were sacred ground. I told them the wolves were the forest's chosen guardians, and to spill their blood here would bring a curse upon the village unto the 7th generation. I spoke with authority I did not know I possessed, and the men believed because the forest made them believe. The trees seemed to lean closer. The wind rose to a howl. The earth trembled beneath their feet. The hunters fled. They dropped torches and weapons and ran like frightened children. Within moments, the clearing was empty except for me and the wolves. Frost Scar approached me slowly, his great head lowered, his amber eyes meeting mine. He pressed his muzzle against my chest, and I felt the connection between us complete itself. I understood then what I was: a guardian, a bridge between the human world and the wild. My grandmother had carried this gift before me. It was not a curse that had driven my pack to abandon me. It was a calling they were too blind to see. In the days that followed, I made my peace with the forest and with myself. I continued living in the great mother tree. But now I was never truly alone. The wolves came and went as they pleased, sharing in the quiet joy of existence. Frost Scar often sat beside me in the evenings, his massive body warm against my side. We did not need words. We had something deeper. The villagers learned to leave offerings at the forest's edge. They no longer sent hunters into sacred territories, and in return, the wolves no longer threatened their livestock. A balance was restored. Spring came eventually. The snow melted and streams ran high. Flowers pushed through the warming earth. I stood at my tree's entrance on a morning golden with sunshine and watched the wolves playing in new grass. Luna pressed against my leg, the scar from her wound now hidden beneath her silver fur. Frost Scar sat nearby, ever watchful, the king who had found his queen in the most unlikely of places. I had been abandoned by those I thought I loved, cast out into wilderness I believed would kill me. Instead, I found a home inside a giant tree and a family among creatures I had been taught to fear. I discovered that the deepest belonging comes not from where we are born, but from where we choose to plant our roots. My name is Alara, and I am no longer lost. I am exactly where I was always meant to be, a guardian of wild places and wild things. The forest knows my name now, and when wolves lift their voices to the moon, I know that somewhere in their song, they are singing of me, the king of the frozen woods and the woman of the great tree. Together, we protect what remains sacred, and in that purpose, I have finally found my peace.